my camera on airplane mode because one time someone called me 8 minutes into my video, so I ended up having to re-record the whole hour-long session. Yeah. But how y'all did heart physiology, right? In the last lab? Yeah. How was that? With the charts and the depolarization, the repolarization, all that stuff. Do you want to go over that? Yeah.
And
there's not really
a lot.
Yeah, the videos, you've been looking at videos, which is awesome.
Like on Khan Academy.
Khan Academy
breaks it down so well.
Khan Academy has an absolutely excellent video on
Crash course too.
Oh yeah, Crash Course.
I like it.
Crash course, did
Yes.
you call it?
Crash Course is great. Khan Academy, I actually watched their like sinodal
And there's a
wave
nurse on
video.
there that does it too. That does a really good one too on the EKGs. I don't know her name, but if you look up like the EKGs on YouTube and you type in like the nurse RN, and she'll pop up like right
Nice.
away.
Alright, so we've got two basic charts that we talk about, two basic graphs, right? In the heart physiology realm. So what does EKG stand for?
Electrocardiogram.
Electrocardiogram. So what are we measuring in electrocardiogram?
The electricity of the heart.
The electricity of the heart, exactly. So since you two came to this morning's session, you guys have to delay your answer.
You know, the one time I have enough confidence to speak up, someone tells me to hush.
Because y'all know the answers.
Yeah,
Well, I
but
kind of missed like a little bit.
If you
of
don't
the
know the
first one.
answer.
Okay,
I'll shut up.
Alright, so we have this electrocardiogram, right?
Mhm.
And we've got this like baseline here. So it starts out flat. And what's the first thing that happens? P wave, right? And what does the P wave stand for? What's the first thing? What's the first part of the heart?
Drill.
Atrial what?
Atrial depolarization.
Atrial depolarization. So what does that mean when the atrium depolarizes?
It's getting ready to beat down. I'm gonna shoot up.
So since we're talking about contractions, right? Depolarization is going to mean contraction or relaxation. Which one? Depolarization. It's actually contraction. Because remember, depolarizing is sending the action potential. So if you're depolarizing, so when you depolarize a nerve, you send the action potential, right? When you depolarize the heart, you contract the heart. It's the same kind of thing. So the depolarizing is like you have a balance and then all of a sudden you upset the balance. It's like a swing. Like if you're holding a swing up, like you always did when you were a kid, and you like bring the swing as high as you can and you hold it. And then you can imagine letting go of the swing as depolarization. It's causing something to happen, it's out of balance now, and then when it comes back and you catch it, it's repolarized now. It's kind of like recharge. So atrial depolarization, so this is, we started contracting the atrium, right? So we got this little plateau, and what comes next? Q, right? Q, and then what's the complex? The QRS complex, yeah. So that's the QRS complex. And what is the QRS complex? What's happening?
The heart just completed a beat.
not completed a beat. It's about halfway through. So just the QRS complex, what part of the heart was working? So the atrium's contracted, right? What's the next thing to contract?
Ventricles?
The ventricles. So the QRS complex is ventricular depolarization. So we've depolarized our atrium, depolarized our ventricles. So now we've got, what's the last part? T wave. And what is the T wave? It has to do with ventricles. So they've depolarized. What do they have to do to be ready for another contraction? They have to repolarize. It's ventricular repolarization. So if you notice, we have a big, we know where it's where the ventricles depolarize. We know where they repolarize, but we can only on the electrocardiogram we can only see where the atrium depolarized. They actually, they do, obviously they repolarize, they recharge, but it's actually hidden in the QRS complex because the contraction of the ventricle is so strong that on the electrocardiogram you can't see the atrial repolarization. So so if this wasn't here, there'd be a little wave. If there wasn't a ventricle depolarization, there'd be a little wave that would be the atrial repolarization. But this is too massive and it covers it up. All right, so that's the basics, right? We just named everything. We've got, but we're not done, of course. We have to make it, we have to analyze everything to the nth degree. So we have intervals and segments, right? What's the first interval?
PQ. Right?
Not PQ actually, but it looks like it sits on the PQ. It's actually the PR, and it's called PR because sometimes the Q doesn't happen. It's not absolutely required. It's not required. Sometimes the Q doesn't register on the electrocardiogram. So if you called it the PQ wave and the Q isn't always there, you won't really know where it stops. So PR wave, or the PR interval, excuse me. So what is the PR interval? So just looking at what we already know is the P wave, right? We already know the P wave is atrial depolarization, right? And then the QRS complex, this is the start of the ventricular depolarization. So so this little area right here is the start of atrial depolarization. So the start of the atrium contracting, right? To the start of the ventricles contracting. Because they don't contract at the same time. They kind of go dun, right? You know how you hear the love dub? The atrium contracts first, and then the ventricle. So that's important, to be able to analyze and look at. So the PR interval is time atrial and
Because he is
got another interval, and it's called the QT interval, right? So what is the, actually go a little further, what is the QT interval? And again, just knowing what's happening, just knowing, knowing what the QRS complex means and what the T wave means. So what is this point right here? What happens at this point?
Depolarization of the ventricle.
Depolarization of ventricles, and then what happens in the T wave?
Repolarization.
So the QT interval tells you how long it took the ventricle to depolarize completely and then repolarize
And this was
completely.
0.1, 0.2, like the seconds. Those
Yeah.
boxes are the
Mhm.
seconds, right?
Exactly, yeah. So
Okay.
on the EKG paper, you read the boxes so that you know how long everything took, because there's time intervals that things should take. We don't care about the time intervals. Don't matter. Doesn't matter for SI. But the QT interval, you can think of it as one round of ventricular contraction. Actually, ventricular contraction and relaxation, to be more specific. Right? So, does that make sense? Do we have any questions about anything so far? No? Okay. It takes a little bit to get used to the graph. What I would suggest when studying the graph, first, don't worry about, I'm doing the intervals and everything, so that we can make sure we all understand them. But when you're studying, first, don't start with, what I would do is I'd make a graph, and I would just label the P, Q, R, S, T, right? And I wouldn't put any of the intervals or anything, just P, Q, R, S, T. And I would label what happens at each, the basic thing that happens at each wave, or the P, Q, R, S, right? Kind of like I did right here. And then, yeah, P, Q, R, S, T. And I would memorize just that. I'd memorize just that, just when the atrium depolarized, when the ventricles depolarized, and when the ventricles repolarized, right? Because then, if you know this is P, Q, R, S, T, right? Because the P and the Q, R, S, T won't be on the practical. It'll be a blank picture.
And we just label the picture.
You won't label the picture. You'll answer questions about it, so you'll have to remember where it goes in your head. Because obviously you can't draw on it because that would be allowed.
Yeah, true.
But if he asks you, if you know what's going on in this graph, and then he asks you what happens in the PR segment, you can say, okay, well, I know the P wave is atrial depolarization, right? And I know this is the start of ventricular depolarization. So the PR wave, or the PR interval, must be measuring from the start of atrial depolarization to the start of ventricular depolarization. It's a lot of words. So that's how I would do it, because if you know what's going on, then he can ask you any question in the book. And then you don't have to memorize every single micro definition. Okay. So we've only got one more segment.
That's the one that I missed.
Ah, okay. So it's this little ST segment.
Oh, never mind.
This little ST segment, right? So what's happening in this ST segment? It's flat, right?
So, it's a hard like at rest.
It is, yeah, so it's not actually at rest, but nothing is changing, because the EKG measures change in voltage, right? So nothing is changing, which means the ventricles just depolarized, they just contracted. So they sit there contracted for a second. and they push all the blood out and they make sure it all gets into the artery, right? So the ST segment is the time that the ventricles stay contracted to make sure all the blood is out. Because if they just did one burst, there'd still be blood in there. And you wouldn't get nearly as much, force. So the ST segment is the time that the ventricles just kind of stay contracted. Cool. So that is basically what you need to know about the electrocardiogram. It's not too bad. It's just a lot of, it's just weird words and segments, acronyms. But I would suggest drawing it out. If you draw it out, it'll make more sense. And also do colors, and do colors for different segments, because that'll help.
EKG too.
Yeah, look at a real EKG. That'll help a lot. Okay, so there was one other chart that you guys studied, right? The pressure graph. Yeah, so the pressure graph is measuring the same thing as the electrocardiogram. It's just measuring pressure instead of electricity. So the electrocardiogram will see all the same things happen in the pressure. It just kind of looks different, but it's the same thing. So this one is pressure. All right. So we've got three pressures on the diagram that we care about, right? So just out of curiosity, does anyone remember which one starts at the highest?
The aortic.
The aortic pressure. Yeah. So there's my aortic pressure, and then which one is the next highest? They're these two are kind of the same, so they're kind of in the same boat, so it's not really, they kind of blend on the graph, so sometimes you don't know which one's higher than the other one, but for clarity's sake, I'm going to draw the ventricular in orange above the atrial. So this is the ventricle pressure, and then this is the aorta pressure, and then this is the, it's the atrial pressure. And this is the aorta. Okay. All right, so we've got this little kind of hump right here, right? What's happening in, you know what, I'm gonna draw the whole diagram out and then we'll look at it. Okay, that'll make it easier. And we'll just analyze it. Alright, so this is one full round of contraction, right? Yeah, so these are the two graphs that you will have to remember and memorize, because there is a possibility that one or both of them could be on the practical. Because if you can read the graphs and label the graphs, then it tells the teacher that you know what you're talking about when it comes to heart physiology. So, we don't like paperwork, but graphs appear. I don't like graphs. Graphs appear everywhere. At least these graphs are more fun than like y equals mx plus b. I don't like those. I don't like those. All right, so we've got the aorta, and we've got all our pressures, right? So we've got this little bump here. This little talking about the same thing. All right, so yeah, so what happened at this little bump right here to
Is that-
cause the ventricular pressure?
Is that when the thing's squeezing your arm?
No. No, so we're not talking about, there's no blood pressure cuff on this person.
Oh.
This is a normal heartbeat, and we're just looking at it
Oh.
on a graph. This is what's happening all the time. So I'll give you a hint. It's a valve.
Atrial.
Mm-hmm.
That atrial valve is.
So you got it right. It's the atrial. What were you gonna say? It's Amy, right?
Me?
Yeah.
Anne Marie.
Anne Marie. It had the A in the end sound. I was close. Anne Marie. What were you gonna say?
I was gonna say the AV when it closes.
The AV valve closes. Yeah. So the AV valve closes. Can you guys all see the blue?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay, that's good. So, because if you imagine in the heart, right?
Mm-hmm.
When it's resting, the valves are open, right? And the atrium is receiving blood, right? And then that valve closes, and so now you've got high pressure in the atrium, and the valve between the atrium and the ventricle is still closed. And then it opens, it lets the blood flow into the ventricle, right? And then when the blood flows into the ventricle and the AV valve closes again, then the ventricle contracts. The AV valve closes so blood can't backflow into the atrium. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because you don't want blood to go backwards. You only want it to go forward.
Mm-hmm.
So this little, like, the pressure, this little dip doesn't cause the AV valve to close. This little dip tells you that the AV valve has closed. So when the AV valve closes, the ventricle contracts and the pressure goes up sky high, right, in the ventricle. And if you notice, it's down in the atrium, which kind of makes sense because you just pumped the blood from the atrium to the ventricle. The ventricle just contracted. The atrium hasn't refilled completely, right? So the AV valve closed, and then what is this? This little, what's happening here? So if you notice the aorta pressure, all of a sudden it's going down a little bit as the blood goes out of the aorta into the body. All of a sudden the aorta pressure goes through the roof, right? It goes really high. So what's the valve connecting the ventricle to the aorta?
The aortic valve? No.
Yeah, I mean it is the aortic valve. So we call them semilunar valves. That's probably how you'll see them. So the semilunar valve, the pressure in the aorta went up. Did it open or close? When pressure goes up, it means blood went in there.
So it opens?
So
It opened, yeah.
it
So
can reduce.
the pressure, so what happened was the AV valve closed, right? The ventricle contracted, and for a microsecond, it contracted with both valves closed, right? And then the pressure in the ventricle got so high that the semilunar valve kind of like flew open, and it let all that blood into the aorta. So the aortic pressure all of a sudden went really high because there's a lot of blood in it all of a sudden. So the semilunar valve opened and let the blood in there. So now the semilunar valve is open, and then it, right here, the pressure in the aorta it should be declining a little bit more. It starts to go down again. So what does that mean? It means it's not getting any more blood, which means, yeah, the SV valve closed, exactly. Semilunar valve closed. So now the semilunar valve is closed, And then we've got one more. So you can see the aortic. I'm sorry, the atrial. There's too many names. The atrial pressure was kind of building, then all of a sudden it dropped, and the ventricular pressure dropped as well. So, what valve do you think? I'll give you a hint. A valve opened. If you notice the atrium and the ventricle pressure went down at the same time, what valve would that be? The atrioventricular valve. So the atrioventricular valve opened, right? So the atrium, because it was closed. So it closed so that blood couldn't backflow, right? But now the ventricle has done its contraction. It's finished. And all the blood is out of the heart, right? So now blood's going to start filling the heart again. And so the AV valve is going to open to let everything to let everything back in, basically.
Let's start the process over.
Exactly. And then this little phase right here, which would eventually go back into another pump, this is kind of where the heart takes a momentary break. It just takes, because you don't have constant bum 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 bum, right? You have bum 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 bum. It takes a little breather. So, I've been saying contract and relax, right? But there's two specific terms that we talk about. What is the term for relaxation of the heart? And these are, when you take someone's blood pressure with the blood pressure cuff, you're looking for these two things as well.
Oh, systolic and systolic.
Yeah, so which one is relaxation? Diastolic, yeah. So this little period right here,
The
the bottom one, this little period right here is called diastole. It means it's resting, right? And in here, both the atrium and the ventricle are in diastole. They're both relaxed for a minute, let blood flow. So then if we're looking at, diastole and systole, what would I call this segment right here? Systole of, what pressure what's the main one? It's this one. Yeah, so this, you can see right here, ventricle is in systole, and now it's in diastole, it's relaxing. So, you will probably not see contraction and relaxation nearly as much as you'll see systole and diastole, so get comfortable using those. Yeah. So those are your two graphs basically. And then this right here, this little hump, would be atrial systole. So, and you can kind of see how the two graphs, when you look at them side by side, you can see how we're looking at the same thing, right? So the P wave is measuring the electrical impulse of the SA node contracting and the atrium contracting, right? SA node tells the atrium to contract, and you can see pressure goes up. And then the QRS complex means that the ventricle is depolarizing, means it's contracting, and you can see the pressure goes up. And then the ST segment is where they're kind of, they're kind of chilling, and then it repolarizes, and that's this little segment down here, and then it's in diastole. And right here, there's nothing until the next P wave. Does that make sense? A little bit? Is there anything confusing still? Is there any questions about these two? you understand what's going on. It's just straight memorization. But if you can remember the basic names, also definitely remember which valves open and close, because that's very important, and that's probably that's one thing that this graph is used to test, is if you know which valves open and close at what points. So again, I would try to personally I would try to find a video on YouTube, and I'll have to see if I can find one. If there's a video where like they have a model or an animation of the heart along with like the EKG, and they show you exactly what's happening, as the EKG goes along. Yeah, because that'd be really helpful
You can see it.
to understand. So when you're sitting down to study this, I would highly recommend looking for a video, and I'll look for a video too. Let's see if I can find one. Cool. So we've got our electrocardiogram, our pressure diagram. We've got 10 minutes. Are there any questions about anything?
I didn't realize how helpful these truly are until I started coming more often than just one time.
Yeah, see, they were helpful.
You know what I kept thinking about as you were describing this, that the heart is really, it's a mechanical pump.
Mhm.
You know, I keep thinking about like the water pump in my car, you know, with the valves opening and closing and stuff. And the only way for the water to get from point A through B and C and then out to D is this whole mechanical process.
Mhm. Yeah.
So it is a mechanical genius.
It's crazy.
It is.
Yeah,
It's
it's
a mechanical genius.
When you use the swing and you let it go and you bring it back.
Oh yeah.
That was a really good example.
Yeah,
'Cause
Yeah.
that is a good example because
Yeah.
it does have that rest. Like she says, it's done it.
Mhm.
It's not da 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 da.
Yeah.
You know? I actually had my daughter had a friend, and he was a doctor, and he was a pediatric heart surgeon.
Oh wow.
So what he would do, listen, when these infants were born, sometimes infants are born without the flap stuff. They don't have the right flap stuff. So he would go in, Leanna, he would go in and correct this.
Oh wow.
That's too scary.
That
He
is
would go,
crazy.
because sometimes infants, some infants
Some don't.
have, this is actually more common than you guys think. That some infants don't have this little flutter, flap here correctly.
You know, heart murmur when
Yes.
the valves don't close. I was
Yes.
born with a
Yeah.
So
heart
he would
murmur.
go in, and he was so good with his hands, I kid you not. He was so good with his hands, and it's
Steady with it.
that Disney asked him to operate on a gorilla's heart in Animal Kingdom
Oh my gosh.
because he
Oh, that
was.
was a good
They
chick.
knew he was a pediatric surgeon, and he would get it right. Do you see what I'm saying?
gosh.
A
Yeah.
good chick.
That was
No,
okay.
that's-
So I'll get down. I just thought you guys might enjoy that
No, that's
kind of
super
segue.
cool.
But yeah, he used to just. Can you imagine doing that? Right?
No, I could
Well,
She
never.
said hello.
I could never be a
Why,
surgeon.
What happened to the girl? Like
He lived.
He did.
I'm not gonna got pizza.
I forgot I had one more time. I had one more thing that I wanted to make sure that we knew. Alright, so this is a beautifully accurate description diagram of the heart, right? It's perfect. Sized appropriately and everything. But we've got the path of conduction, right? We're gonna talk about the path of conduction real quick. So where does the heart generates its own electrical pulse, right? So where does that electrical pulse start? What chamber of the heart?
Like the atrium.
The atrium, yeah.
The right.
Which atrium? The right atrium. And what is that called? It's called the pacemaker of the heart. But it's got a specific name. Wait. I'm waiting. I almost started writing. As I said, I'm
SA
waiting.
note.
SA note. Oh no, I forgot my umbrella in the car.
That's good.
Me too.
The SA node, right? And SA stands for sinoatrial, which makes sense because it's in the atrium. So we've got the SA node, that's our first step. So that is going to fire That's gonna fire an electrical signal first. And then where does that electrical signal go? It goes to another node. What is that node called?
AV.
AV node. And what does AV stand for? Atrioventricular, which should tell you where it sits, right? Right by the atrium and the ventricle. So it goes to the AV node. Oh, my finger out there. And the AV node connects to what's the next path that it takes? Right down the middle.
It goes
the
into the
septum.
ventricle, right?
It goes to the ventricle, but it travels down, it doesn't go into the ventricle, it travels down the septum here. But what is the structure? It's not a node anymore. A bundle of His, exactly. Yep. So this is, so while it's in the septum, right? It's called the bundle of His. And I want to know who he is. And he just decided to name it his. You're welcome. So the bundle of His, and then what is, so that's the second, or that's the third point, right? And then what do we call them when they're down here and they go up into on the other side of the ventricle? The Purkinje fibers, exactly.
I remember something.
Yeah, look at that. The Purkinje fibers. I always liked saying Purkinje, even when I wasn't sure where they were. So we got the Purkinje fibers, and that's the fourth step. So you can see how the SA node contracts, the SA node fires, the AV, or the atrium contracts, and then the AV node fires, and it causes the ventricles to contract, or it goes all the way down, then the ventricles contract. So you can kind of see how it starts from the atrium and why the atrium would contract first, and then down into the ventricles, right? Yeah. So, and if the SA node conks out, do you die? If your SA node, if all your SA node cells die, would you die?
No, because isn't there one to like back it up where it like helps speed it like between like 30 and something beats per minute?
Yeah, so
What is it called?
the AV node. The AV node will take over.
Yeah.
So the AV node can take over.
And your heart rate is
So
super
you
low.
don't need to know these numbers, but the SA node will beat at about will make your heart beat between 60 and 100 beats per minute.
And that's like between 30 and
Yeah, this is between I believe 60 and 70 or something like that. It's like a middle range. And then if your AV node goes out, the bundle of His actually takes over. And the heartbeat goes from like 40 to 60 beats per minute. So you're not in great shape. You know, you're pretty sick. You're really sick, and you should get to a doctor. But you're not instantly dying. And then actually your Purkinje fibers can take over. If all else fails, your Purkinje fibers will give you a heartbeat about 20 to 40
Oh,
beats
we
per
had
minute.
that all the time on our floor.
how many beats
crazy.
is the bundle His?
I don't remember exactly. It's not needed. You guys don't need to know it. I don't remember exactly.
So it has this backup redundancy system.
That's
Yeah.
good.
So, and I mean, if all four systems fail, then
Your heart
that's
stopped
it.
And you go there.
It's like I've given you 4 backup systems,
And you
I don't know what else to give you.
Still messed up.
Yeah, I don't know what else to do for you.
Me.
You do? I like
do not
cardiology. I think it's fun.
We work on the cardiac flow, and every 3 or 4 hours, I think it was 8, 12, 4, something like that. And they have the ladies from the 5th floor send down their sheets of all their patients, because